right, so we got the planet Mars up on the screen, and I think most of us here know that the modern name for Mars comes from the Latin god of war. And so let's take a peek at him real quick. Mars was known as a furious warrior, as a god who brings pestilence, as a wolf god, and as a god of the spring. So those are probably four of his primary attributes. And the leading scholar of Roman religion is a guy named Georges Dumézil, and his masterwork is called Archaic Roman Religion, and it's his ideas that kind of dominate the modern field. And so he believes that Latin religion is based upon three different structures of society in early Indo-European culture, and that Mars represents the warrior class. So Mars is the god who presides over the exercise of physical prowess. He's the god of warriors and soldiers. Mircea Eliade, who we've cited many times, congratulates Dumézil as showing that only by deciphering the basic ideological system underlying the social and religious institutions can a particular divine figure, myth, or ritual be correctly understood. And another leading scholar calls Dumézil's achievement among the foremost scholarly achievements of our time. And so Dumézil is, without question, a world-class scholar. The guy was a master of dozens of languages, produced countless books and manuscripts. He is indeed an imposing figure. But here is his ultimate conclusion, that the Latin god Mars represents the warrior class, strictly a social metaphor, and that Mars does not have a naturalistic aspect. His area of influence, the place of his signs, is not the atmosphere. Another leading modern scholar, after acknowledging that Dumézil's the top expert, asks the question whether a pattern uniting the apparently incoherent details of Mars's cult can be discovered. For a possible guide to this question, we would turn to leads from Babylonian astronomical traditions, which obviously predate Rome by a while. And so if you look at how Mars is represented in ancient Babylonian texts, he's described as a furious warrior, as a bringer of pestilence, and as a wolf star. Now that's kind of a coincidence. So in one of these astronomical texts, it says Mars is said to bring pestilence or deaths in an astrological report. Mars is said to have caused a fever. But this is exactly the way the Latin god Mars is described in the very earliest Latin passages that we have. So they say Mars confers blessings, but's prone to anger. He sends harvest failures and cattle plagues. A very famous Latin ritual was called the Arvela Carmen, and there Mars is invoked as a wild and potentially destructive power who can afflict crops with disease. So there's almost a one-to-one correspondence between the way the Latin god Mars is described as an agent of pestilence and the way the Babylonian planet is. So now if we turn to the Mesopotamian cult of the god Nergal, who was widely acknowledged to be the planet Mars, we find him described as a raging warrior, as an agent of pestilence. He's a raging storm god and a ruler of the underworld. So one ancient text from about 2000 BC says, warrior, raging storm tide who flattens the lands in upheaval, warrior, lord of the underworld. He's consistently described as a furiously raging storm, but a constant adjective is at the bottom. He's called hush, which means a fiery red, furious, or rage. So we're going to see this motif again and again, and in descriptions of these ancient warriors or warrior gods, they're always going to be a fiery red, and they're going to be described as raging. But of course, the Mesopotamian scholars have no idea where Nergal comes from either. He's just a complete mystery. So this is arguably the top guy in Sumerian studies, and he says to take an absolutely fundamental question, who or what is Nergal? Well, this is an early description of Nergal. The vanguard whose strength is sublime, whose divine splendor is sublime in heaven, star ever shining, sublime of features. She said, sounds like they're describing a star, maybe. So at the bottom it says, Nergal, warrior of the gods, who takes his place in the height of heaven, whose features ever glow in heaven. I mean, anybody that can read can understand that they're describing something in heaven. Whether it's the planet Mars, as the scribes themselves maintained, remains open to question, I suppose. But there can't be any question that they're describing a celestial power. So back to Dumezil again. Here's the way he describes the warrior god Mars in Latin cult. The ambiguous character of Mars, when he breaks loose on the field of battle, accounts for the epithet sikus, blind, given to him by the poets. At a certain stage of furor, he abandons himself to his nature, destroying friend as well as foe. So this indiscriminate slaughter associated with Mars is going to be a recurring theme, and it's found around the world. So in Arab texts, it just so happens that the planet Mars was described as the blind one. And so it says, they give to Mars the name Mara Samya, which means the blind Lord. And they call him blind because of his extreme violence, and because in his rage he strikes without regard. So here you have almost the exact same description as we found in the Latin god Mars. This is a recent book talking about literature, and it just says, the battle fury of warriors is traditionally the quintessential subject matter of heroic verse. The wrath or furor of heroic warriors is, as Milton acknowledges, the salient theme of both the Iliad and the Aeneid. So to take Achilles, for example, this is the top, one of the top scholars of Greek myth is a guy named Gregory Nagy. So here's the way he describes Achilles. Achilles himself in his climactic moments of rage, and Bill Mullen will confirm the first word in the Iliad is rage, by the way, describing Achilles. But it says, Achilles himself in his climactic moments of rage is described as equal to Ares. Ares is the god of war, but he is also more specifically the god of martial fury. In war, a warrior who is possessed by the god Ares experiences this kind of martial fury, which is typically bestial. The Greek word for this martial fury is lysa, meaning wolfish rage. And of course, we know Ares was represented as a wolf, just like the Latin god was. To experience such a martial rage is to be beside oneself, and to be beside oneself is to be possessed by Ares. So there's a recent book on Germanic warrior types. It's just a fascinating book, and it discusses these early warrior societies where young men would drive themselves to ecstatic prowess, and they just head off looking for the nearest war. And it says, warrior styles have much to offer to our understanding of history. They tell us how long ago, when war was still welcome, fighting men reached the state of ecstasy that led them to do astounding things. They lead us into the heart of Vedic, Indian, Homeric, Celtic, and Germanic civilizations where fighting prowess was still the measure of the man. And again, this was obviously that tradition went on for many thousands of years. Here's how Macrobius describes the Latin god Mars. And to the glowing heat by which the spirit is kindled and roused, sometimes to anger, sometimes to deeds of valor, to a temporary madness. To this property, men have given the name Mars. Pretty much the exact same description that Georges Dumézil gave to the blind warrior. As those of you will know who have read my books, it just turns out that cultures all around the world said that they imitated the planet Mars when they went into battle. They were trying to incorporate his rage or to emulate his rage or fury when they took to the battlefield. So this is a quote from the a leading ritual of the Pawnee Indians in North America. So it says, "This is the way I do when I am imitating him, the planet Mars, when I become angry when I am imitating him." Move to South America. At times of battle, the planet Mars had to endow the Toba warriors with fighting spirit. As a Polynesian god of war is known as Maru, flaming with wrath and full of anger. Australian Aborigines, the planet Mars is Bilyara the eagle. He was warlike and much given to fighting. Early Indian astronomical text, as in Asian India. Mars has blood-red eyes, is fickle-minded, and given to anger. Now, when you go out tonight and look at the clear Phoenix skies, look at the planet Mars and see if you see an angry planet. The nature of Mars, this is Roger Bacon from the Middle Ages, the nature of Mars is fiery to excite men to anger, discord, and wars. And this is the leading scholar on ancient astrological ideas, Franz Cumont, and he points out that these ideas are basic to language. There can perhaps be no more striking proof of the power and popularity of astrological beliefs and the influence which they have exercised over popular language. All modern idioms preserve traces of it, which we can no longer discern except with difficulty, survivals of vanished superstitions. Do we still remember when we speak of a martial character that it must have been formed by the planet Mars? That one of these astra stars, which if hostile will cause me a disaster. So he's admitting that the word disaster has a direct relation to stars. Turning to the leading Irish hero, he's a fascinating character because he offers just a crystal clear image of this raging warrior. And it says, so when this guy went into battle, he became distorted with anger and battle fury. He grew gigantic in size, and like Mars, he fought indiscriminately, killing friends and foes right and left. Now, the interesting thing about that Irish hero is he was blind. And all of us will remember the classic example of the blind warrior is the biblical Samson. And how was he described? Well, he was characterized by a hot anger, a red hot anger. So Judges describes his anger being kindled. Interestingly enough, Samson has been identified with the planet Mars. The ancient Celtic term for Cuchulain's raging hot anger is F-E-R-G, ferg. And in my opinion, that's a cognate word with the furor belli of the Latin god Mars. Back to the Irish god again. It says, when he was undergoing his furor, he became crimson all over, shook violently, and assumed a swollen form. The top Irish scholar of ancient warriors said that the key to figuring out these figures is that all words for hero express the notions of furor, ardor, tumescence, which means swelling, and speed. The hero, the warrior hero, is the furious one, possessed of his own tumultuous and blazing energy. If you turn to back now again to the cult of the Mesopotamian star god Nergal, clearly described as the planet Mars, one of his epithet describes him as the sweller. But the word sweller also means anger and fury. So you get this image of this giant planet god, red, clearly red, that takes on a massive form when he's angry and starts causing disasters. So very early on, this is an image that Dave and I drew up, or actually simulated it with a computer with life-size planetary models. So the polar configuration is over on the left. The yellow body is Saturn, the green body is Venus, and the red body is Mars, just for the sake of illustration. And what this shows is that with just the slightest displacement of Mars towards the Earth, it grows massive in size. And so the Polynesian name for the planet Mars, interestingly enough, is the quick swelling one. Again, if you look at Mars in the sky today, see if that idea would ever occur to you that Mars is a quick swelling planet or warrior. So we all know that the Greek Hercules was identified with the planet Mars by the Greeks themselves. Less known is the fact that Hercules was identified with this Mesopotamian god Nergal. Very well known is the fact that Heracles served as a young male's role model as a warrior, as an athlete. And so again, archaic warriors everywhere reenacted in masked dances the deeds of the gods and ancestors. They did so to gain the divine ecstasy of the beginning of time, the time of creation. In battle, when it mattered most to live in these mythical times, warriors bodied forth gods and ancestors by fighting in their style. They wanted to emulate the gods. So according to this text, it says the Batavi going to battle sang of Hercules. The Spartans did the same thing when they went into battle, and of course Spartans were known as being among the greatest warriors of the ancient world. They invoked Hercules. They wanted to be like Heracles. It's very well known among Greek scholars that the Greek Heracles was identified with the great god of ancient Tyre, a Phoenician cult, and Melkart in turn was identified with the Mesopotamian god Nergal of the planet Mars. So the characteristic rite described in the Old Testament about this Phoenician god Melkart is that every year he was burnt to death on a great funeral pyre. So how did Heracles meet his end? He was burnt to death on a funeral pyre. And so Sophocles describes this at great length in one of his plays. So it says, at the precise moment of agonizing death, a flaming thunderbolt from his father Zeus strikes Heracles. He goes up in flames in a spectacular explosion of fire. As he mounted the pyre, we are told in this tragedy I was just talking about, came a terrible outburst of anger. The bodily pains which he felt united with that disease of the heroes, their fits of rage, which is never very far from madness. Interestingly enough, Australian Aboriginal tradition relates of the planet Mars that he died in a fire, that he died on a funeral pyre and changed into the planet Mars. It is said that he was burnt to death on a mountain where he had kindled a fire. This is an early Greek vase showing at the bottom Heracles' funeral pyre. At the top, he is flying off to heaven where he's going to receive his apotheosis. And so the top scholar of these ancient vases, James Boardman, says, on 2 of the 3 Attic vases with the pyre, Heracles is shown as a young man, so he's been burnt to death, but now he's rejuvenated. So it says the young Heracles has clearly been rejuvenated by his experience being burnt. So the early writer Nanos specifically describes Heracles as the phoenix, compares him to the phoenix bird for regaining his youth in fire. Turning back to the Latin cult, one of the most exciting discoveries of the last 100 years was they found these Etruscan vases depicting the Latin god Mars as getting a fiery bath here at the hands of Minerva. And again, Dumézil and the other guys discuss all this stuff, and they discuss these vases, and they say, well, it's clear the little guy's being rejuvenated, but we really don't have an explanation for why that might be the case. He's being rejuvenated by means of fire. So the first meaning says this means that Mars is intended to be reborn from death. And a clear description says he lived to be 123 years old, and he died 2 or 3 times and came back. So he's a resurrected god, the Latin god Mars. The Mesopotamian god was resurrected as well. Josephus, the writer on early Jewish stories, keeps using the word egersis in connection with Heracles, but that word also is specifically used to describe resurrection, the resurrection. In ancient Iranian myth, there was a really curious little figure named Batraz, and like Heracles, he is burnt on a giant funeral pyre. He's again one of these raging warriors that kills anyone indiscriminately right and left. He's the greatest warrior of the Iranian warriors. And so it says, this guy will henceforth live in the sky, from which he will descend in a burst, incandescent as at his birth, whenever some danger or scandal threatens his kin. And interestingly enough, he descends from heaven as a furious red ball, periodically descending to earth like lightning. So again, this is an image you're going to see again and again, that this fiery red star is going to grow massive, descend from heaven as a raging form, but in a lightning-like shape, or as a meteor. So turning back to the Mesopotamian cult, the planet Mars is specifically described as fire falling from the sky, this Semitic term, mikut ishatu. But that same word also means lightning, and it also means the fall of a meteor. Pliny the Elder said that these thunderbolts come from the planet Saturn, much as the inflammatory ones come from the planet Mars. So the planet Mars was clearly associated with lightning and or thunderbolts. Again, the image from yesterday we showed with Mars descending slightly from Venus on the left, and then the one from today showing it as a massive form. I think it's easy to see that if something like this actually transpired in the skies overhead, you might think of a massive red ball or meteor descending from heaven, causing disaster. So earlier we talked about the Pawnee traditions where they emulated the fiery warrior. They clearly called him the planet Mars as they went into battle, and yet they claimed that this guy, the Pawnee Mars, had came from a meteor. The Latin god Mars, it was said that on the first day of the year that his shield fell from heaven. So at the base of the screen it says, worship of meteorites was easily extended to ancient monoliths. Mars's ancial, the shield, is the best known instance. Back to the Iranian figure that was burnt to death on the pyre, he was, an interesting story told about him was that he was described as an abscess. And so you see this a lot in the text, that the Martian warrior is described as a pus-filled little guy, as an ulcer, but often as an abscess. Interestingly, that Semitic word describing Mars as fire, lightning, and meteor, it also means abscess. The Mesopotamian god Nergal himself was known as the pimply one. But the same word also means lightning or ecstatic. So this is a current picture of the planet Mars. I think it's easy to see that if this object appeared in the northern circumpolar heavens, that you might easily say that that looks like a pimply formed god. We noted that the last characteristic of the Latin god was that he was the god of the spring. Now that doesn't quite jibe with the others at first sight. And yet Australian Aboriginal tradition also remembers the planet Mars as the god of the spring. So this little guy was the head honcho of their warrior societies. They painted themselves red as they headed into war, but they said the red star was seen to be responsible for spring, and he personified sexual activity and fertility. Interestingly enough, a very similar tradition is found in early Chinese text, where the red star is associated with the arrival of spring, the beginning of the year. The exact same thing as the Latin god Mars is associated with the beginning of the year and the beginning of spring. So this is my conclusion. The sacred traditions attached to the Latin god Mars, far from reflecting the different class structures of archaic Indo-European culture, encode the remembered history of the planet Mars, albeit much humanized and historized. A radical rewriting of history is in order. We've only just begun. And I think if you think about these images and think about Mars moving close to Earth, look at the physical structure of Mars now. What would you expect? I mean, Mars looks like a destroyed planet, a scarred planet. If it engaged in these catastrophes well within the memory of man, would you expect to see something like that? Would that help explain why Mars doesn't have an atmosphere like most other planets? Why Mars' oceans of water have apparently been ripped off? Why rocks from Mars have been ripped off the planet and deposited on the planet Earth. If Mars participated in these disasters like Dave and I have been talking about for 30-some years, what would that tell you about the likelihood of current life on Mars? I mean, it'd be pretty tough to imagine anything other than single-celled animals or primitive organisms living up there now. Certainly these folks talking about the pyramids being up on Mars and Martians invading us every now and then, they're pretty unlikely to be right, I would suggest. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.